I've always had a soft spot for the character of Mr. Hyde. He's been a reoccurring villain in the Marvel Universe for years, and his origins trace all the way back to 1963 from an issue of Journey into Mystery. In that sense then, he could be considered to be a Thor villain, but to be honest, he's made that many appearances and fought that many Marvel superheroes across the years that he doesn't really feel like he belongs as part of the roster of any particular superhero's rogues gallery. And as such, that gives him a degree of flexibility and ambiguity that makes him a really interesting and fun character when he does pop up. Plus, his appearances have been rather sporadic across the years and he's been used fairly sparingly. So whenever he does pop up in a comic book, I'm always really glad to see him, and it always feels fresh and interesting and kind of fun. So, as you can imagine, I was really thrilled when he was finally announced to make his debut in the Marvel Legends line, and no less, he was appearing as a Build-A-Figure too. Now, interestingly, he was the Build-A-Figure for the movie line of Shang-Chi figures, and you had to buy all 6 of these characters to build Mr. Hyde. Now, I've got to be honest, this seems a little bit random to me, because obviously Mr. Hyde has very little to do with this movie or any of these characters, so it seemed a little bit arbitrary and it didn't really seem that appropriate, to be honest. It also presented a bit of a problem for me because I don't really generally collect the movie line of figures, so I really wanted this Build-A-Figure, but I didn't want the 6 that I had to buy to build him up. So I suppose the ultimate question I would pose is this figure worth it? Well, I think the first thing to note with this figure is that on first impressions, he does certainly look the part, but on closer inspection, I'm not sure this is quite right. In virtually every comic book I've read with an appearance by this character, he's been wearing a cloak. Obviously, that is absent here, and that was the first thing I noticed. Now, it's by no means a deal breaker, he's still in his suit and he still has an overcoat, but his cloak has always been a very distinctive part of his visual aesthetic, and that's very crucial when we're dealing with a visual medium, so he doesn't feel quite right without it. Also, you'll notice that there are no real paint apps or washes running through this figure. What you're getting is the base plastic mould, and it is that base green, which is fine, but again, it just really needs a little bit of extra love and care when it comes to the paint apps to really build on the sculpt that's there and just make it look a little bit more authentic, a little bit more detailed, and it's could have been so easily done with just a black wash just running through it just to really enhance some of the shading and shadowing on this costume. As it is, it does look a little bit unfinished. Now, his overcoat and his waistcoat are all one piece, and it is a fairly hard plastic. It's not a soft, malleable rubber as you might expect from some other recent releases. So this definitely presents problems when it comes to articulation, which we'll touch on a bit later. But one thing I do really like is the head sculpt. I think they've done a fantastic job here. This is a fantastic, very monstrous looking Mr. Hyde, which is absolutely perfect. He should be pure blind fury, and yeah, he looks properly monstrous here. He looks very mad, and I think this is great. So I really love this head sculpt. I also think the paint apps on the head are very nicely done as well. So there's no real wash running through the hair, but if we look at the eyes and the teeth and the gums, and even around the eyes, we can see there's a lot of different paint apps and washes running through this. And this looks really good. This is solid stuff. I'm really very pleased with the result. Now, interestingly, they have decided to sculpt in a bowler hat, so it's not removable. It is part of the head sculpt. Again, the bowler hat probably isn't something I associate with the character. I certainly don't mind having it. I think it works perfectly fine. I think it works well for this figure, so it's nice to have. But again, I think probably for the character, maybe it would have been more of a top hat rather than the bowler hat, but I might be mistaken. But once again, there's a real lack of attention to detail here in terms of the paint apps, because clearly there is sculpted in a rim around this bowler hat, and it would have been so easy to just paint that in with another colour, black, brown, red, anything would have been appreciated here, just to accentuate a little bit of colour, a little bit of detailing, a little bit of shading perhaps, just to make the hat look a bit more interesting, make it look a bit more visually eye-catching, and just a bit more authentic. Now, I'm sure anyone who's built the Joe Fix-It or the Kingpin Build-A-Figures will recognise most of the parts on this figure, because obviously they have been recycled, so particularly the body, the arms and the legs have all been recycled from those figures. But the central overcoat is new, and so are the hands. I haven't seen these hands used before. They look to be unique to Mr. Hyde. He's got broken nails in there. He's got very hairy, the back of his hands there. So this looks to be properly, distinctly, uniquely Mr. Hyde. And I think they've done a really nice job. Again, the sculpt is fantastic. There is a bit more paint apps on the back of the hands to denote the hairs on them, which looks really cool. But again, it's a shame there isn't more paint apps around the nails or in the palm of the hands, because this is actually a really fantastic sculpt, because a lot of these nails are broken and chipped and damaged, and it looks great. It just needs to be enhanced with the paint wash to really bring it out. And then the legs and the shoes obviously have just been recycled from the Kingpin and Joe Fixit, so there are no real surprises here. This is stuff we've all seen before. Now then, in terms of articulation, he does have a ball joint in the head, so of course he can spin his head from side to side, and it can look up and down. It's more of a nod, really, than being able to really lift his head up at a great distance, but it works just about. He does have ball joints in the shoulders, which allow the arms to kick out a fair distance, but it's not as broad a range as you may hope. He's complemented with a pin swivel at the elbow, so the lower arm can rotate 360 degrees, and of course it can hinge to roughly 90 degrees as well. And then there's another pin swivel at the wrist, so the hand can rotate 360 degrees, and of course it can hinge forwards and backwards. There's a little bit of resistance when it comes to the cuffs, so depending on what position you've got it in, you'll be able to hinge it more forwards or backwards. Now he's got a straight swivel at the waist, so he can spin from side to side, and I do think that he has an ab crunch here. Now you can't really see the joint because of course it's hidden by the overcoat, which is all one piece and you can't remove it, but I can just detect the line of where an ab crunch should be, but sadly I can't get the best of it. I cannot get it to really work at all because of the stiffness of the coat, so really this is null and void. He's got ball joints at the hips, of course they do kick out, but again there is that real strong resistance from the hard plastic of his overcoat that really they don't kick out a big distance, nor do they kick forwards or backwards particularly far because of the resistance from the hardness of the plastic. But he does have the upper thigh swivel, and he does also have a pin swivel at the lower leg, allowing the lower leg to rotate from side to side and of course hinge to, well, just less than 90 degrees. And then there's one final ball joint in the ankle, which allows the foot to sort of gently pop forwards and backwards, hinge a little bit, and it kind of wobbles from side to side, but there's not really a huge range of motion in these feet, and that was exactly the same on the Kingpin and the Hulk Joe Fixit Build-A-Figures as well. He does come with one accessory, and that is his cane, and for the most part I think this is quite nicely done. It's a fairly simple design, and again the paint apps are minimal, but at least there are two tones, and I think it looks pretty good all in all. I think it certainly does the job as an extra prop. He can really hold it in two ways. He can either have it out more genteelly like this, or he can grip it by the staff. Either way it looks fine, and in both cases the hand is moulded perfectly so that it will accommodate it with no slippage. It's not going to come out of his hand. It fits nice and snug in both instances. So then, final thoughts. Well, for me, I'm going to give him 3 stars. On the one hand, I am really glad to have this character. He's been a much loved character for me and a much wanted character in the Marvel Legends line for a long time. And I do really like the head sculpt. I think it's absolutely really brilliant. I think it's a fantastic job of the expression on the face and the paint apps, and I think this looks really, really good. And overall, his general bearing is pretty sinister and in keeping with the character. So I think they've done a pretty good job of capturing the essence of the character, but there definitely are a few misfires on this figure. First of all, as I've mentioned, obviously he doesn't have the overcoat. Now, for me, that is a big part of how I think and visualise this character. So that is kind of integral, really. So it's a shame that we haven't got that. Now, it's possible that we may get a re-release down the line and he'll include that, and I hope so. But as it stands, this one doesn't come with it, so that is disappointing. The next issue I really have with the figure is just the lack of paint apps, and this is something that I find increasingly with the Marvel Legends line from Hasbro, is that they do fantastic sculpts, but they don't capitalise on it with a really good paint wash and make the most of some of these fantastic sculpts and lines and details that they have in the mould. So I think it's a real shame because it ends up with the figure looking a little bit less interesting, a little bit more dull, and ultimately feeling a bit cheaper than it actually is. And I think that this figure is a particularly egregious example of that, because the whole figure seems to be pretty much one tone of green hard plastic, and there's very little paint washes running throughout the vast majority of this figure, which is a real shame because I do think there's some really interesting points. The head sculpt, the hands are all fantastic, and it's just, you know, if that had run through the body as well, just having a little bit of darker shading and shadowing here and there, I think this would have been a much more visually interesting figure than it actually is at the moment. So then at the beginning of the video I did pose the question, is he worth buying all 6 figures for? Honestly, for me, personally, no. Now, as always, there is a caveat here. If you are a huge fan of Shang-Chi or you collect the movie figures generally for the Marvel Legends line, then this will probably be a no-brainer. If you want all those figures, then absolutely he's worth it. But if, like me, you don't collect the movie figures, or say you're not a big fan of the Shang-Chi film in particular, then you're going to have issues with this. And I don't think ultimately the money that you're going to be putting down is going to be worth it for this one Build-A-Figure. So that leaves you with a bit of a quandary if you are in that situation. What do you do if you are a fan of Mr. Hyde? Well, you've got a couple of different options. You can either wait and hope that they repackage him as a deluxe standalone figure later on, maybe a variant, maybe he'll come with his cloak, that could happen. Or alternatively, you could just search the secondary market to see if you can pick him up readily assembled for a better price. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.